The craft had a word for the moment. Civilization understood it was going to. Diveraka. It did not translate well into other languages. Most languages in the galaxy did not need a word for it. Most civilizations, when they saw the craft fleet appear above their world, did not have time to build one. They simply felt the thing and then they were gone. The craft had been collecting that feeling for 4,000 years. They were not the biggest species in the galaxy. They were not the smartest. Their technology was not the most advanced, and their ships were not the most elegant. What they were was simple. They were the most willing to hurt something, any something, everything. They had climbed to the top of their own world by being the one creature on it that refused to stop fighting no matter how badly the fight was going. Bone broken, keep going. Blood lost, keep going. Half dead, keep going. That willingness had taken them to the stars, and once they were in the stars, they found that most of what lived there had never had to fight the way the craft had fought. Species that evolved on gentle worlds, species that had built peace among themselves before they reached space, species that had intelligence and culture and art and philosophy. None of that stopped a craft boarding party. The craft warlord prime was named Vorksign. He was old even by craft standards, which meant he had survived long enough to become something his species almost never produced. A strategist. Most craft commanders won by throwing bodies at a problem until the problem ran out of room to breathe. Vorksign won by understanding his enemies before he destroyed them. He was standing on the command deck of his flagship, the Bone Throne, when the report came in about the humans. His second in command, a younger male named Diarath, handed him the data tablet. Vorksign looked at it for a long time. He had 7 fingers on each hand, and they were each the length of a human forearm. The tablet looked like a card in his grip. How long, he asked. 2 of their centuries in deep space, Diarath said. They move fast for a young species. Vorksign looked at the image of the human home world, blue and white, small. The species itself was smaller. Soft-skinned, 2-limbed bipeds with no armor, no natural weapons worth discussing. Average lifespan barely century. They had discovered faster than light travel only 200 years ago and had already spread across 43 star systems. Any resistance history? Vorksign asked. Against other species, minor territorial conflicts, nothing significant. Diarath paused. Against each other, extensive. They have been at war with themselves for most of their recorded history. Vorksign set the tablet down. Send the ultimatum, he said. Commander Elena Vasquez received the craft message at 3:40 hours ship time aboard the UES. Steadfast, she was already awake. She had not slept well in 3 weeks. Not since the first long-range sensors had picked up the craft fleet massing at the edge of human space. She read the message twice. It was not complex. The craft did not write complex ultimatums. This one said in the trading language used across the galaxy: submit or be removed. You have one of your planet cycles to decide. Her communications officer, a young man named Tors, was watching her face. What does it say, Commander? She set the message down on her desk. Outside the viewport, stars burned cold and distant and completely indifferent to the situation. It says we have a year, she said. Tors waited to decide if we want to exist, she added. The silence on the Bridge lasted about 4 seconds, then everyone started talking at once. The Galactic Assembly was a body of 31 space-faring civilizations that had existed. For about 2,000 years, it had rules, procedures, diplomatic protocols, and a long history of absolutely failing to stop the craft from doing anything. When humanity applied for emergency membership and requested military support, the assembly convened within 48 hours. That was fast by assembly standard. Ambassadors from 11 species appeared on screen before the human delegation. Some of them were sympathetic, some of them were not. The Tenhari ambassador spoke first. The Tenhari were tall, gray, and very old. As a civilization, they had survived the craft by giving them what they wanted and staying out of their way. It had cost the Tenhari most of their outer colonies and about a third of their pride, but they were still alive. We understand your situation, the Tenhari ambassador said, his voice through the translator was flat. We advise compliance. The craft are not a force that can be stopped. They can only be survived. The human ambassador, a woman named Dr. Priya Akifer, looked at him for a moment with respect. She said, "That is the most useless advice I have ever received in my professional life." Tenhari ambassador blinked his 4 eyes. "You do not understand what you are facing. Tell me." So he did. The craft had wiped out 14 civilizations, not defeated them, not conquered them, wiped them out the way you wipe bacteria off a surface. The Doroth had been a species of 8 billion across 12 worlds. Now they were a notation in assembly records and a series of ruins that the craft used for target practice. The Mavari had tried to fight. They had a strong military, good ships, brave soldiers. The craft had spent 11 years grinding them down planet by planet until the last Mavari city was rubble, and the last Mavari soldiers were fighting in the ruins with hand weapons. And then the craft had glassed the planet from orbit and moved on. The Stalin had tried to negotiate. They had offered resources, territory, labor, technology. The craft had taken everything they offered and then destroyed them anyway. The craft did not negotiate. They accepted tribute as a form of entertainment and then collected Varaka when they got bored. Dr. Aker listened to all of this. Then she said, "What are the craft afraid of?" The Tenhari ambassador looked at her the way someone looks at a child who has said something that proves they don't understand the room they are in. "Nothing," he said. "That is the point. Everything is afraid of something." She said he had no answer for that. The year passed faster than anyone wanted it to. On Earth there were protests. Some people wanted to fight. Some people wanted to negotiate. Some people wanted to pack everything into generation ships and run for the outer edge of the galaxy and hope the craft got distracted. The debates were loud and sometimes violent and very human in the way that human debates tended to be, but the military kept building. Elena Vasquez spent the year doing 3 things: sleeping badly, reading every piece of craft military data the assembly had given humanity access to, and training. The craft fought in a specific way. They came in hard and fast, overwhelming the enemy's front line before it could organize. Their ships were heavily armored and carried enormous forward firepower. Their boarding troops were 7 to 9 ft tall, covered in natural bone plating under their armor and strong enough to tear through a steel door with their bare Hands, they had never lost a major engagement. They had never faced humans. Vasquez wrote a document. It was 40 pages long, and it had a simple title, What They Don't Know About Us. The first line read, they have never fought something that knew it was going to lose and attacked anyway. The craft fleet entered human space on a Tuesday. Nobody had planned for it to be a Tuesday. The universe does not schedule itself around human convenience, but it was a Tuesday mid-morning on the eastern seaboard of Earth when the long-range sensors lit up across every human listening post from one end of inhabited space to the other. 412 ships. Largest of them was 3 km long. It moved through space the way a glacier moves across a landscape, not fast but with the complete certainty that nothing in front of it was going to remain standing. Torres was on the bridge of the Steadfast when the fleet appeared on sensors. He had been awake for 19 hours. He looked at the screen for a long moment. There are so many of them, he said. Not to anyone, just to the air. Vasquez was already in her command chair. She had been there for 2 hours. Yes, she said. What do we do? She looked at the screen. 412 ships each. One built by a species that had been doing this for 4,000 years. Each one crewed by soldiers who had never learned to feel fear the same way human beings felt it, because fear for the craft had simply been beaten out of the species by evolution. We do what we always do, she said. Tor waited. We make them regret it, she said. Vorexine watched the human fleet on his tactical screen. 61 ships. He had been told to expect 61 ships. He had been told the largest human vessel was 800 m long and that their weapons technology was about 40 years behind craft standard. He had been told the humans had made a formal rejection of the ultimatum and were preparing to resist. He had fought species that resisted before. Analysis, he said to his tactical officer. Standard defensive formation. The officer said, they are grouping their heaviest ships at the center. The smaller fast attack vessels are on the flanks. They appear to be holding position rather than advancing. Vorexine looked at the formation. It was not bad for a species that had never fought the craft. They had done some reading. They are waiting, Dyer said beside him. Why are they waiting? They should be retreating. Vorexine did not answer. He was thinking about something the assembly briefing had mentioned, something he had almost dismissed. The humans had been at war with themselves for most of their recorded history. Every weapon they had first used against each other. Every tactic, every formation, every piece of military technology, all of it had been tested in conflict before it ever reached space. Most species the craft faced had built their militaries to fight something else, some external threat, some other species. Humans had built their military to fight humans. Send the first wave, Vorexine said, but he was still thinking. Vasquez watched the craft formation break. 40 ships peeled away from the main fleet and began their approach run. They came in a standard craft assault pattern, widespread closing fast, designed to overwhelm point defense systems by attacking from too many angles at once. She had read about this pattern. She had run simulations of this pattern for 11 months. She keyed her comm. All ships execute Plan 7. The human fleet did something the craft tactical officer had not anticipated. It moved backward, not retreating, not breaking formation. The entire 61-ship fleet began a controlled, coordinated withdrawal, pulling back at a specific speed, maintaining exact spacing between vessels. The craft assault wave followed. It would have been strange not to follow. The humans were running, except they weren't. They were pulling the craft assault wave into a corridor. On either side of that corridor, invisible against the sensor noise of a nearby asteroid belt, 12 human fast attack ships were waiting. They were not the biggest ships in the human fleet. They were not the most heavily armed, but they were fast, and they were carrying something the craft had not seen in the assembly's intelligence reports, because it had been finished 3 weeks ago. Vasquez said, "Fire." The first battle of what would later be called the Krareft War lasted 4 hours and 18 minutes. The craft lost 9 ships. The humans lost 7. By any mathematical measure, the craft had come out slightly ahead. They had more ships. They could absorb the loss, but Vorexine sat on his command deck after the human fleet had pulled back, and he was quiet. For a long time, the craft had never lost 9 ships in an opening engagement, not against anyone. Mevari, who had been their most difficult enemy in recorded history, had destroyed 4 ships in their first battle. After that, it had been a slow grind toward the Mavari's inevitable end. Humans had destroyed 9 ships in 4 hours, and they had not broken. Dr. Wrath was watching him, a setback. Dr. Wrath said, "We have them outmatched 4-2. 1. We will grind them down." Vorexine did not respond. He was reading the tactical logs. He was looking at the moment the human ships had fired from the asteroid belt. He was running the calculation backward. He was understanding that the human commander had set that trap before the battle started, had planned it, had moved her whole fleet in a specific way to make it work. She had expected to lose ships. She had planned for it. She had decided in advance how many of her own people she was willing to lose to kill 9 of his, and she had executed that plan without hesitation. "They are not fighting to win," Vorexine said quietly. Diarath looked at him. "What, not yet?" Vorexine stood up. He was tall enough that his head nearly touched the ceiling of the command deck. "They are fighting to learn. Every ship they lose, they are learning something. Every engagement." He paused. "They are not afraid of losing." Dr. Wrath made a dismissive sound. "Every species fights harder when cornered. It does not change the outcome." Vorexine looked at the tactical screen. The human fleet had pulled back to a defensive line near their second closest populated system. 61 ships minus 7. Still in formation, still holding, not retreating to their home world, still fighting. "Get me everything the assembly has ever recorded about human military history," he said. "Everything, all of it." Diarath blinked. "That will take time." "Then start now." Vorexine looked at the screen. Somewhere behind those 54 ships was a species that had been fighting itself for its entire existence. Species that had built weapons to kill other humans. A species that had written the word for fighting when you know you will lose into their history so many times. It was practically a cultural value. For the first time in his 700 years, Vorexine felt something he did not immediately have a name for. It sat in his chest like a stone. He did not know yet that it was the first syllable of a word. Voraka the craft took the colony world of Harvin 3 on a Thursday. It took them 11 minutes. There was no Fleet defending it, no orbital guns, no. Resistance ships sitting in the dark, waiting to ambush them. The planet just sat there quiet, turning slowly in the light of its yellow star, and the craft descended without firing a single shot. Dyer walked through the colony's main settlement with 40 soldiers at his back, and found it empty. Not destroyed, not burned, not evacuated. In panic, with food still on tables and doors left open the way it looked when a population ran in fear. It was clean, orderly, the kind of empty that meant someone had made a decision, packed carefully, taken everything worth taking, and left. The streets were clean. The power was still running. Every door was locked. Dyer ordered his troops to break into the largest building, which appeared to be some kind of administrative center. They breached the door in the standard pathway, which involved 2 soldiers pulling it off its frame with their bare hands. Explosion that followed killed both soldiers and took out the front wall of the building. Dyer picked himself up off the ground. His armor had held. His ears were ringing. He looked at the smoke where the entrance used to be and understood what had happened. The humans had left, and they had left presence. It was the same on every colony world the craft took in the first 3 months. Empty settlements, sometimes lightly defended, with small units of human soldiers who fought from cover, inflicted casualties, and then disappeared before the craft. Numbers could surround them, never a fixed defense, never a line. The humans were willing to die holding just contact. Damage withdrawal, like being bitten by something you could not catch. Vorexine. Read the reports each morning. The casualty numbers were not catastrophic. The craft was still moving forward, still taking systems. By any map you could draw, they were winning. Human space was shrinking. The humans had lost 6 colony worlds and 2 mining stations, but the craft had lost in 3 months of what should have been a clean advance. 219 soldiers. 219 soldiers to booby traps, ambushes, remote detonations, hit and run engagements, and 1 incident in which a single human soldier in a powered suit had held a corridor on a mining station for 4 hours against a squad of 11 craft before the station's reactor had exploded, an explosion which analysis suggested was deliberate. Vorexine had read that report 3 times. 1 human, 4 hours, deliberate reactor detonation. He had finished reading the history of human warfare, all of it, thousands of years of humans fighting other humans. He had read about a battle on their home world centuries ago where 300 soldiers from a small nation had held a narrow mountain pass against an army of thousands and died to the last man and were still celebrated as heroes thousands of years later. He had read about pilots who flew their damaged aircraft into enemy ships, soldiers who threw themselves on explosive devices to save the people next to them, commanders who knew a battle was lost and ordered a charge anyway because every minute they held bought time for something else. Somewhere else. He put the history files down. He stared at the wall for a while. The craft did not have a concept of dying for something. They had dying because you were not strong enough not to. They had dying because you made a mistake. They had dying as a result of a calculation that went wrong, but dying on purpose, as a strategy, as a gift to someone else that was not in the craft framework. It made no biological sense. It produced no offspring. It gained no resources. When a craft soldier was going to die, The craft soldier tried not to die. If they could not avoid it, they killed as many enemies as possible first. That was the whole of it. They treat their dead like currency, Vorksign said. Diorath looked up from his meal. What, they? Humans? Vorksign was standing at the viewport. The stars outside were the same stars they always were. They spend their dead like money. They decide in advance what a death is worth, and they pay it if the price is right. That is not rational. No, Vorksign turned from the viewport. It is not, which means our models for their behavior are wrong. We have been predicting what a rational enemy would do. They are not rational. Diorath set down his food. All enemies break. It is a matter of pressure and time. Every enemy we have faced before broke because they were protecting something. Vorksign said. Their home world, their families, their civilization. We could always find what they were protecting and threaten it. When the threat was large enough, they stopped fighting. He paused. What if they are protecting the idea of not giving in? What do you threaten then? Diorath had no answer. The ship moved through the dark between stars, and neither of them spoke for a while. Vasquez had set up her new command post on the Asterisk. Use constant Asterisk, a heavy cruiser that had been her second choice before the Steadfast took a craft rail cannon hit to the engine section 6 weeks ago. The Steadfast was being repaired at a station deeper in human space. Vasquez had transferred her flag and kept moving. She had 44 ships now. She had started with 61. She did not sleep much. When she did, she dreamed about the faces of the crew she had lost. That was not useful. She had learned to wake up from those dreams, drink a glass of water, and look at the tactical maps until the faces went away. The maps were more useful than the dreams. She had a team of 12 people. She called her Brain Trust. It was an informal name, not an official designation. They were a mix of military strategists, xenobiologists, psychologists, and one historian named Dr. Theo Park, who had spent his career studying how civilizations ended. He was the most quietly frightening person Vasquez had ever met, and she found his presence on the ship comforting in the way that sharp things are sometimes comforting. They're adapting, Park said one evening. They were looking at the tactical data from the last 4 engagements. Look at their approach patterns. They've stopped using the standard assault spread. They're doing something different. Vasquez looked. He was right. The craft were changing how they attacked, tightening their formations, moving more carefully, not coming in with the confident, open spread of a predator that expected nothing to bite back, coming in the way. Something comes in when it has learned that the grass might be hiding something. They're being careful, she said. Yes, Park tapped the screen. Careful is slower. Careful costs them efficiency. Careful means they're thinking about us differently than they thought about anyone else. Vasquez looked at the screen. 44 ships. The craft had 43. We need them to stay careful, she said. Then we need to keep being unpredictable. Park said we need to keep doing things that don't make sense until after they happen. The Battle of Meridian Station was the first time human and craft soldiers fought on the same ground in significant numbers. Meridian was a deep space refueling and repair station, big enough to be considered a small city, sitting at a strategic junction point between 3 human star systems. Vasquez had chosen to defend it, not because she thought she could hold it forever. She knew she couldn't. She chose to defend it because she wanted to teach the craft something. And you could only teach people things by making them feel it. The craft came in with 12 ships and 4,000 ground troops. Vasquez had 9 ships and 1,200 soldiers inside the station. The space battle lasted 2 hours. The craft punched through the station's external defenses and got 3 boarding ships attached to its hull. Then the human crews inside the station did something the craft boarding troops were not prepared for. They let them in, not because they had to. They pulled back deliberately, giving up corridors, letting the craft advance into the station's interior. The craft troops moved through the corridors in their standard breach formation. Heavy soldiers first, armor up, pushing forward. They found empty corridors, open rooms. The lights were on, the environmental systems were running. It felt exactly like Harvin 3. The first squad of craft reached the central junction of the station's main hub. The floor dropped. Not exploded, not shot, dropped. A 30-meter section of flooring simply fell away, and 8 craft soldiers went down into the maintenance level below, which had been flooded with a chemical compound that reacted badly with craft biology. Before the second squad could respond, 3 doors opened simultaneously, and human soldiers came through them, not charging, moving fast and low, using the cover of the corridor edges, firing weapons designed for exactly this distance and exactly this target profile. The craft's second squad fought back. They were larger, stronger. Individual craft soldiers were harder to kill than individual human soldiers. The biology was just different. A hit that would end a human fight kept going, but there were 200 humans in that station, and they had spent 3 months learning how craft troops moved, how they communicated, how they responded to contact. Vasquez had made every soldier in her command watch recordings of every craft engagement in the assembly's database. They had built replicas of craft equipment in training areas and practiced fighting around it. The craft troops had never seen humans fight before today. The battle inside Meridian Station lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, the craft had taken the station. They had lost 600 soldiers. Vasquez had lost 411. She pulled her remaining forces out through a back docking bay in ships that had been prepositioned there 2 weeks ago. On her way out, she hit the switch that started the station's self-destruct sequencer. Meridian Station came apart in a quiet white flash that the craft flagship recorded on sensors. Where a strategic junction station had been, there was now a cloud of debris. The craft had spent 9 hours and 600 lives to take a piece of infrastructure that no longer existed. Vasquez looked at the flash on the screen. She did not say anything for a moment. 411, she said finally. The number hung in the air of the command deck. Torres, who was at the comm station, kept his eyes on his board. She took a breath, held it, let it go. Log it, she said, and get me a line to Admiral Chen. We have to talk about what comes next. Vorexine received the report on Meridian Station and read it standing up. 612 dead, the station destroyed. Humans had fought a losing battle for 9 hours, inflicted those casualties, and then burned down the building on their way out. He sat down. In 4,000 years of craft conquest, no enemy had ever forced a loss ratio of that type in a defensive engagement. They knew they would lose. The Mavari, the most difficult enemy in craft history, had Never once destroyed a captured installation before withdrawing. It had simply not occurred to them. When they Mavari lost a position, they retreated. They tried to take it back later. It was a rational response to a loss. This was not rational. He sent a communication to the Krath High Council, which he had never done before in the middle of a campaign. The Krara High Council existed primarily to sanction campaigns after they were won. Reporting problems to the High Council was something young commanders did. Before they learned not to, Vorexine did it anyway. His message was short. It said, the humans fight differently than any enemy in our history. I need more ships and I need more time. This will not be quick. The response came back in 40 hours. It said, you have what you have. Finish it. Vorexine read that response. Then he put it down and walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars. He had been doing this for 7 centuries, 40 worlds, 14 civilizations. He had never sent a message like that to the High Council, and he had never expected the answer to make him feel small, but the answer made him feel small because it meant that the High Council, sitting safe and certain at the center of craft space, believed this was like every other campaign, believed it was a matter of pushing long enough and hard enough, believed these humans would eventually feel the thing all the others had felt. Vorexine was no longer certain that was going to happen. He was starting to wonder in the part of his mind that he was trained not to listen to if the opposite was possible. If it was possible that a species existed which could be pushed and pushed and pushed, and instead of breaking, simply pushed back harder each time, learning, adjusting, spending its dead like they meant something and coming back with the bill. He thought about that human soldier in the corridor, 4 hours alone. Then a deliberate explosion. What kind of species produces something like that? He didn't sleep well that night, which was new for him, which was, though he would not have used the word frightening. 6 months into the war, Vasquez stopped running, not all at once. It was not a dramatic decision made in a single moment. It was more like the way a tide turns, slow, inevitable, and only obvious in hindsight when you looked back at where it started. She had 41 ships. She had lost 3 more since Meridian. She had also in those 6 months learned things about craft fleet movements that she could not have learned any other way. You had to be in the fight to learn them. You had to absorb the hits and study what came before them. The brain trust had been working around the clock, and Dr. Park had 17 whiteboards in his cabin now, all covered in notes, and he only slept when someone physically turned his lights off. What they had found was a seam. The craft fleet was enormous. 400 ships do not run on confidence alone. They run on fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, food for troops, medical supplies. A 400-ship military operation produces a logistics train that stretches back thousands of light years to the craft home systems. That logistics train has to move through space on a schedule because 400 ships cannot wait. They have to keep pushing. The schedule was the same. The craft resupply convoys moved through corridor of space near the Kepler relay, a navigation point that the craft had marked as secured territory. 6 weeks into the war, it was by every scan the craft ran empty space. No human ships, no human installation, just dark. Vasquez had put 6 ships there 4 months ago and told them to go completely silent. No active sensors, no communications. Nothing that could be detected, just sit, wait, watch. They had watched 31 craft convoys move through that corridor. They knew the schedule. They knew the ship counts. They knew the sensor sweep patterns the craft escort vessels ran and exactly how long each sweep took and exactly what the blind spots were. Vasquez looked at the plan. Her team had built and felt something she had not felt in 6 months. Possibility. We hit Convoy 14, she said. It's the biggest and it's carrying propulsion components for their main battle group. They lose those parts, they lose maneuverability for 6 weeks minimum, while they wait for replacements. Park looked at the plan. If they trace the attack back to us before we're gone, we lose those 6 ships. Yes, and we lose the intelligence advantage. They'll change the convoy routes. Yes, Vasquez looked at him. We've learned what we can learn from watching. Now we have to start making them react to us instead of the other way around. Park looked at the plan for a moment longer. All right, he said. The attack on craft Convoy 14 lasted 8 minutes. The 6 human ships came out of their silence like something waking up, angry, hit the convoy from 3 angles simultaneously, destroyed the 4 escort vessels before the craft could organize a response, and then turned their weapons on the cargo ships. 7 of the 9 cargo ships were destroyed. 2 escaped. The humans were gone before any response fleet could get close. Total human losses: none. Vorexine read the report and threw the tablet across his command deck. It hit the far wall and cracked. Dire wrath. Watch it fall to the floor, he said. Nothing. Vorexine stood in the center of the room with his fists closed and breath. The loss of those propulsion components was significant but manageable. Replacement parts were already being rude. What was not manageable was the implication. Those ships had been sitting silent in what should have been secured space for months. Patient watching. He had never heard of an enemy doing that before. Every species the craft had fought had used their forces actively, had sent scouts they could detect, had built defenses they could find and destroy. These humans had used their ships like held breath. They were there the whole time. Direth said yes. How many other positions like that are there? Vorexine did not answer because the answer was that he did not know, and not knowing was new and had an unpleasant texture to it. He changed the convoy routes. He added more sensor sweeps. He pulled 2 ships off the front line and turned them into dedicated patrol craft for the supply corridor. Then he got a second message from the High Council. It said, the campaign is taking too long. Take a human population center. Make an example. End this. He read it twice. He understood what it meant. The High Council was impatient. The High Council wanted to see the look on humanity's face that they had seen on every other face. They wanted Voraka. He pulled up the map of human space and found a target. The planet was called New Carthage. It had a population of 600,000. It was not a military target. It had no strategic value. It was a farming colony, mostly flat land, lots of grain, some cattle, a few small cities, the kind of place that exists in every civilization's expansion. Not glamorous, not important, just people living their lives far from anywhere that mattered. Vorexine chose it because it was close to the front line and lightly defended. He did not enjoy this part of the work. This was not something he would have admitted to Dr. Rath or to anyone else, but it was true. He was a soldier. He had been built by his life to destroy military forces. Burning farms felt like something else, something that did not sit clean. But the High Council had spoken, and the High Council did not ask how things felt. He sent a detachment of 30 ships toward New Carthage. He did not know that Vasquez had predicted this. Park had been the one to see it. He had been reading craft history, not their military campaigns, which had been thoroughly analyzed, but their political history, the structure of craft, leadership, how the High Council functioned, what it did when campaigns ran long. They have a pattern. He had told Vasquez 2 months ago, standing in front of one of his whiteboards. When a campaign takes more than a certain length of time, the High Council pressures the field commander to produce a symbolic victory, something visible, something that looks like dominance, rather than just progress. They've done it in 7 of the 14 major campaigns in their history. Vasquez had looked at the whiteboard, a civilian target. Yes, usually the closest significant population center that can be hit without diverting too many forces from the main push. She had looked at the map for a long time. New Carthage, she said. That would be my guess. Park said, it's close, it's soft, and it's visible enough to be a statement. Vasquez had started making calls that same day, quietly, without logging the orders. The main command record, because the main command record could theoretically be captured and read. She had moved civilian evacuation through New Carthage over the following 6 weeks, slow enough not to look like a sudden panic departure, fast enough to move 400,000 people off planet before the craft arrived. The remaining 200,000 were military volunteers and a portion of the population who had refused to leave, and those people had been given the choice 3 times, and on the 3rd time, Vasquez had stopped asking. Underneath the farms in the flat land of New Carthage, human engineers had been working for 2 months. The craft detachment arrived at New Carthage and immediately detected the population reduction. Sensors showed significantly fewer heat signatures than recorded. Population data suggested the detachment commander, a mid-rank officer named Scar, sent an alert back to Vorexine and then decided to proceed. It looked like a partial evacuation. Some people had run, some had stayed. This was normal. This was what civilians did. He brought his 30 ships into orbit. His ground forces began their descent. Landing craft, standard approach 40 degrees. Entry, dispersed formation, each craft carrying 100 soldiers. The landing craft were about 300 m above the surface when the ground opened up. Not in one place, in 40 places. Simultaneously. Launch tubes installed over 2 months of careful work fired surface to air. Weapons straight up, 19 craft landing. Craft were destroyed before they reached the ground. The soldiers who survived the landing hit the surface and found it defended, not by a militia, not by civilians with light arms, by soldiers dug in, prepared. Every field and every street and every building had been turned into a defensive position. Scar pulled his ships into attack formation and began orbital bombardment to support the ground troops. The bombardment hit decoy positions. The human soldiers had been moving since the craft landed, shifting, never staying where they were when the last scan was taken. The orbital guns were firing at empty trenches and abandoned buildings and carefully constructed false heat signatures. The ground battle lasted 2 days. Then Vasquez arrived. She had been waiting at the edge of the system with 20 ships outside craft sensor range. When the craft detachment was fully committed to the ground operation with its attention split between the surface fight and the orbital support, she brought her fleet in from behind the planet's moon, 20 ships against 30. Better odds than she had worked within months. The battle in orbit lasted 6 hours. The craft lost 19 ships. Vasquez lost 4. The 11 remaining craft ships broke off and ran. In craft history, going back 4,000 years, a craft military force had never broken off and run from a human-sized engagement. Vasquez watched them go on her tactical screen. The bridge of the constant was quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight in it. Tor said very softly, "Did we just—" "Yes," Vasquez said. "News travels fast in a galaxy that has had faster than light communication for 2,000 years. The Battle of New Carthage was in assembly channels within 18 hours. Within 48 hours it had been transmitted to every member civilization's news network. Within a week it was the most discussed event in the assembly since the craft had first appeared at the edge of known space. The Tenhari ambassador, the same one who had told Dr. Akifer that the craft could only be survived, requested an emergency session. At that session he said something that no Tenhari official had said out loud in recorded memory. "We would like to discuss the possibility of material support for humanity's defense effort." Dr. Akifer, who had been sitting in assembly sessions for 6 months, listening to politely worded expressions of sympathy that came with absolutely nothing attached to them, looked at the Tenhari ambassador for a long moment. "I thought the craft couldn't be stopped," she said. "Only survived." The Tenhari ambassador had the good grace to look like he understood the rebuke. "We may have been working from incomplete information," he said. 2 other member civilizations made similar offers before the session ended. Small things: fuel supplies, access to repair facilities outside human space. Nothing that constituted an alliance, nothing that put anyone else in the direct path of the craft response. But something had shifted. The assembly had spent 4,000 years understanding that the craft were the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. That understanding had been the background radiation of galactic politics for longer than most current civilizations had been in space. It was the thing everyone knew and no one argued with, because arguing with a fact was pointless. New Carthage had cracked the fact, not broken it, not disproved it, just put a hairline fracture in it that let a little light through. Vorexine received the report on New Carthage alone. He had asked Dirath to leave the command deck. He had not explained why, and Dira had not asked. He read the numbers: 19 ships destroyed, 11 in retreat. The ground operation failed. The human population largely already evacuated when the craft arrived. She had known he was coming. She had read his patterns the way he had spent 7 centuries reading enemy patterns. She had studied him, predicted him, set a trap designed specifically for the move he would make under specific political pressure. He sat for a long time. He thought about what it meant that a human commander had understood craft political pressure well enough to predict his tactical decisions 2 months before he made them. It meant she had studied the craft the way the craft studied prey. It meant she did not think of the craft as an Unstoppable force, she thought of the craft as a problem. Vorexine had destroyed 14 civilizations. In all that time, no enemy had ever treated the craft as a problem to be solved. They had treated the craft as a disaster to be endured or escaped. This human woman was treating him like a puzzle, and she was solving it. He pulled up his communication terminal and started composing a message to the High Council, not a report, a recommendation. It said we should discuss terms. He deleted it. He wrote it again. He deleted it again. He sat in the dark of his command deck for a very long time. And then he made a different decision. The kind of decision that felt like stepping off a ledge in the dark, not knowing how far down the ground was. He was going to end this himself, not by retreating, not by negotiating, by committing everything he had to one decisive engagement, crush the human fleet completely, take their home world, deliver the High Council what they wanted, or find out finally and completely what this species was made of. He began drafting orders for a full fleet advance toward Earth. Somewhere in human space, Vasquez was looking at the same tactical map and reaching the same conclusion. They were moving toward each other now. The last question was who had spent the past year learning more. 381 ships, that was what the long-range sensors showed. When the craft fleet committed to its final advance, Vasquez stood in front of the tactical display and looked at the number for a long time without speaking. Behind her, the bridge of the Constant was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system running. 381 ships moving in a formation that stretched across 400,000 km of space, heading for Earth at a pace that said they were not in a hurry, not because they were being careful, because they were not afraid of anything that might be waiting for them. Tor broke the silence. How many do we have? 53. Vasquez said. He didn't say anything. After that, she had spent the 3 weeks since New Carthage doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was building, the second was asking. The building was a weapons program that her chief engineer, a short and permanently exhausted woman named Commander Yuki Sito, had been working on for 4 months in the repair bays of a station so far from the front line that the craft didn't know it existed. Sito had not slept well in 4 months. She had also not complained once, which Vasquez found both admirable and slightly worrying. What Sito had built were not larger guns, they were not better shields, they were smaller and faster, and designed to do one specific thing that nothing else in the human arsenal could do yet. The asking was harder. Vasquez had transmitted a direct personal message to the ambassadors of the Tenhari, the Stalin survivors, the Mevari survivors, and 9 other civilizations that had reason to want the craft stopped. The message was not diplomatic in the formal sense. It was short and honest. It said, "They are coming for us in 3 weeks with everything they have. If we lose your next, not eventually, soon. I am not asking for your full military. I am asking for any ships you can spare and the willingness to stand beside us once in the history of this galaxy. You will not get another chance to make this choice." 8 civilizations sent nothing. The Tenhari sent 12 ships. A civilization called the Vet, small and quiet and mostly known for their astronomical research, sent 4 ships, crewed entirely by volunteers. Their ambassador had transmitted a note alongside the ship manifest. It said, We have watched the craft take everything from everyone for 2,000 years. We would like at least once to have done something about it. Vasquez read that note 3 times. She sent back, "Welcome to the fight, Vorexine." Watched his fleet advance and felt for the first time in a long time like himself again. This was what he was. This was what all of it had been. Building toward the supply raid. New Carthage, the long months of bite and retreat, all of it was about to become irrelevant. He had 381 warships, and the humans had, according to his best intelligence, somewhere between 50 and 60, even with the Tenhari ships and whoever else had answered their request. They could not reach numbers that made this survivable for them. The math was simply the math. He stood at his viewport and watched his fleet move through space and let himself feel good about it just for a moment. Dr. Rath was at the command console running final checks. All ships confirm advanced formation. Estimated contact in 19 hours. Good. The High Council has been monitoring our position updates. They are pleased. Vorexine almost smiled at the pause around that word. The High Council being pleased was a sensation he had not experienced in some month. They should be, he said. He did not say what he was also thinking, which was that the thing that had kept him awake for weeks was still there. The human commander had predicted his move at New Carthage 2 months before he made it. She had been inside his head in a way no enemy had ever been. She would know this was coming. She had known every other move was coming, and she had planned for each one. What had she planned for this? He pushed the thought down. There was nothing to plan for this. The math was the math. Vasquez called the full briefing 14 hours before contact. Every commanding officer in the combined human and allied fleet attended via screen. 61 faces. The Tenhari commander was a tall gray figure who kept his expression carefully neutral. The 4 vet captains looked to Vasquez like scientists who had decided to do something completely out of character and were holding their nerve through sheer stubbornness. She liked them immediately. She stood in front of the tactical map and explained the plan clearly and without decorating it. They are going to hit us with everything, she said. We are not going to let them. She moved through it step by step. The human fleet would not form a standard defensive line. A defensive line against these numbers was just a slower way to lose. Instead, the fleet would split into 7 groups and operate independently, each one with its own target assignments and its own authority to maneuver. No central formation to break, no single point to overwhelm. 7 separate problems. She watched the faces on screen as she said this. Some of them understood immediately. Some of them had questions. She answered the questions plainly, then she showed them the second part. In the past year, we have collected sensor data from every engagement with the craft fleet. She said, we have mapped their command communication patterns. The craft fleet command structure requires constant active communication between the flagship and 12 command vessels to function. Those 13 ships are always within a specific distance of each other because their communication system doesn't work beyond that range. She highlighted the 13 ships on the tactical display. If those ships are destroyed or disabled simultaneously, the craft fleet loses coordinated command. Individual ships can still Fight, but they cannot execute complex fleet maneuvers. They lose the ability to respond to a changing situation as a unified force. She paused. We have been building weapons specifically designed to hit those 13 ships at the same moment. See those weapons for months of no sleep. The Tenhari commander spoke. His translator made his voice flat and precise, destroying the flagship while the Warlord Prime is aboard would require penetrating the heaviest armor in the craft fleet. Yes, Vasquez said. That is extremely difficult. Yes, what are the chances your weapons succeed? Vasquez looked at him. Better than the chances of us winning a straight fight against 381 ships. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded once. Proceed, he said. The battle began the way craft battles always began, fast, loud, overwhelming. The craft fleet came in with its forward ships firing before human vessels were even fully in range, filling the space ahead of them with weapons. Fire the way you fill a room with light, not aimed at specific targets yet, just establishing presence, establishing dominance, making the space in front of them feel owned. It had worked for 4,000 years. The human fleet did not form up to receive the charge. It scattered 7 groups, peeling away in 7 directions, each one moving with purpose rather than panic, each one already heading toward its assigned position. The craft formation designed to crash through defensive line hit empty space. Vorexine saw it immediately. Adjust formation. Pursue Group 3 and Group 7. Those are the heaviest. The human groups had already changed direction. The next 4 hours were unlike any battle Vorexine had ever fought. The craft fleet was enormous and powerful and completely unable to bring that power to bear cleanly, because every time a craft formation organized to pursue one group of human ships, 2 other groups were already attacking from a different angle. The human ships were not trying to destroy the craft fleet. They were trying to keep it moving, reacting, constantly turning, constantly reforming, burning fuel and focus and response time, keeping it busy. Vorexine was issuing orders at a pace he had never had to work it before. The command deck felt like a different place than it normally felt. Loud, hot, 3 different tactical officers talking at once. He did not see Cito's weapons coming. Nobody did, because that was what they were built for. They were small, smaller than standard missiles. They moved faster than anything in the craft sensor library, and they were coated in a material that scattered sensor returns. They had been launched from 6 different human ships at 6 different moments over the past 2 hours, aimed at pre-calculated intercept positions, not chasing their targets but arriving where their targets would be. 12 of the 13 command ships were hit in a window of 4 seconds. The 13th took an additional 8 seconds because its captain had moved it slightly out of predicted position. Flagship the Bone Throne took 4 simultaneous impacts on its command section. Vorexine was thrown across the command deck. He hit the far wall and dropped. The lights went red. Noise was enormous, and then it was not. In the way that very loud things leave a silence behind them, he lay on the floor of his command deck and looked at the ceiling. Diarath. He turned his head. Diara's console had taken a direct hit. There was nothing there worth looking at. Vorexine looked at the ceiling again. His ears were ringing. His left arm was broken. He could tell by the way it sat when he Tried to move it, he got up anyway. Without coordinated command, 381 craft. Ships became 381 individual decisions, happening simultaneously with no shared logic. Some captains pushed forward aggressively, some pulled back to regroup, some tried to protect the damaged flagship, some tried to find the human ships that had fired the weapons. They got in each other's way. Friendly fire incidents broke out in two sectors of the battle as craft ships maneuvered without knowing where their own forces were moving. Vasquez had been waiting for this exact moment. All groups execute phase 2. The 7 human groups stopped scattering. They turned all of them at once from 7 different angles, driving into the disorganized craft formation with every weapon firing. The next 2 hours were the most brutal of the war. The craft ships were still powerful. Individual craft captains were still good. Many of them found each other and formed up in small groups and fought with everything they had, but they were reacting to humans. Now, Vasquez dictated where the fight went to. She had spent a year learning to react to the craft. She had spent that same year building the ability to do this, to make them react to her instead. Every human group knew where the other 6 were. The craft did not know where anything was. The asterisk constant took 3 hits. One of them opened a section of the crew deck to space. Vasquez felt the ship shudder under her feet and kept issuing orders to bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Kept his hands on his board and kept working. It was not clean. It was not how battles looked in simulations. It was loud and costly and terrifying, and it kept going long past the point where Vasquez had started losing track of which ships had gone silent on the comm network. She did not look at the casualty list. Not yet, not now. Later, Vorexine restored partial command communications 90 minutes after the strike. In those 90 minutes he had lost 63 ships. He had his remaining officers gather what data they could while he stood at the damaged viewport of the bone throne with his broken arm held against his side. The viewport had cracked but not failed. He could see the battle through it, the distant flashes of destroyed ships, the movement of forces in the dark. The human fleet was smaller, slower than it had been. Some of them were barely moving, holding position and fighting through damage. But they were not breaking. He thought about giving the order to push through, to lose whatever he had to lose to take Earth the way the High Council wanted. He had the numbers still. He could do it. He stood at the cracked viewport and did the honest calculation. He could take Earth probably at a cost that the High Council would find acceptable, because the High Council was not here paying it. And then what? He had studied enough human history to know the answer to that question. These people did not stop when you took their ground. They did not feel asterisk Varaka the way every other species felt it. Every planet the craft took would become another meridian station. Every city would become a trap. Every corridor would be another human soldier willing to hold it alone for 4 hours. He could take Earth and spend the next decade losing 1,000 soldiers a week to a species that had decided somewhere deep in its violent, complicated history that losing was not the same as being done. He closed his eyes, opened them all. Ships, he said into the command channel, his voice flat and clear and completely without expression. Disengage, withdraw to rally point 7. There was a pause on the channel. His Captains had never heard that order before, not one of them in all their years of service had ever heard a craft fleet ordered to withdraw. Warlord Prime, the voice was one of his. Senior captains, a veteran, please. Confirm. Confirmed, Vorexine said, disengage. Now, the craft fleet for the first time in 4,000 years of recorded military history retreated. Not a detachment, not a patrol vessel, not 11 ships from a failed colonial operation. The fleet, Vasquez watched them go. She watched them go for a long time and did not speak. The bridge around her was very quiet. Tor had stopped bleeding. Someone had given him a bandage and he had put it on without looking up from his board and was still working. There. Going, he said. Yes, she said, there. Actually going. She looked at the tactical screen. The craft fleet still enormous, still powerful, pulling back. Running the real calculation, maybe for the first time understanding that winning every battle was not enough if the thing you were fighting learned something from every loss. She thought about all the faces she would look at on the casualty list. Later, get me a damage report, she said, and someone tell Dr. Offer the assembly is going to want to talk to us very soon. She sat down in the command chair and looked at the empty space where the craft fleet had been. Outside the cracked viewport, the stars were exactly as they always were, cold and distant and completely indifferent. She did not care. She was still here. The High Council stripped Vorexine of his command on the same day he arrived. At the rally point, they did not wait for a report. They did not ask for an explanation. Snorts, the message was waiting for him when the asterisk bone throne limped into Krath space with its cracked hull and its dead and its broken warlord, and it said in the flat official language of Kraref governance, you are relieved. Report to the council chamber. Your fleet is transferred to Warlord Prime Harak. He read it standing in the same spot where Dyra used to stand. He stood there for a while. Then he handed the tablet to a junior officer, told her to log the transfer orders, and went to his cabin to sit in the dark for a few hours before the long journey home. Her was everything the High Council wanted. In the moment they were in, young for a Warlord Prime, barely 3 centuries old, he had won 6 campaigns in the outer reaches, all of them fast in total. He had never faced an enemy that lasted more than 8 months. He had never sent a message to the High Council asking for more time. He believed in the way that people who have only ever won believe things, that winning was mostly a matter of wanting it enough and being willing to pay whatever the fight cost. He stood before the council and listened to the briefing on the human campaign and looked at the losses and said, the problem was hesitation. We should have taken their home world in the first month. The council liked that. They gave him 340 ships, rebuilt and resupplied, and sent him back toward human space. Vorexine watched the fleet depart from a window in the council administrative complex where he had been assigned quarters. While he waited for formal proceedings, he watched those 340 ships move out of Krath space and felt something he had never felt before when watching a Krath fleet advance. Dread not for himself, for Harak. He had spent the week since his return reading everything one more time, not craft history, human history. He had read it the first time looking for weaknesses, trying to understand how they fought. He read it the second time differently. He read it trying to understand what they What he found was not a military answer. He found a species that had been broken over and over throughout its entire existence. Civilizations they had built had collapsed, wars they had fought had cost them generations. Diseases, famine, disasters, they had recorded all of it. They had written it down in hundreds of languages over thousands of years with an honesty that was strange to him. The craft did not record failures in that way. Failures were things to move past. You did not dwell on them. Humans dwelled on everything. They wrote about their losses the way other species wrote about victories. They built monuments to battles they had lost. They named their children after people who had died for causes that failed. They carried their grief forward like it was fuel and burned it to keep moving. He had read about a human concept. It had many different names in many different languages, but it came down to the same idea, the belief that suffering was not the end of a thing but part of it, that you could go through the worst and come out the other side changed and still present, still there. He sat in his assigned quarters and looked at the wall. He thought about 340 ships moving toward a species that had survived everything its own history had thrown at it and still showed up. He picked up his comm terminal. He stared at it for a long time. Then he did something that, as far as he could find in any craft record, no craft officer had ever done in 4,000 years of military history. He composed a message to Commander Elena Vasquez. She received it 11 days before Har's fleet crossed into human space. It was written in the assembly trade language, careful and precise. It did not begin with an apology. It did not explain itself emotionally. It was in form a military communication. It listed Harak's approach vector, his fleet composition, his tactical preferences based on 6 previous campaigns, the position of his command ships relative to his formation, the frequency patterns of his fleet communications. At the end, there was one additional line that was not part of the tactical information. It said, "He does not know what I know. Make it count." No signature. The origin routing was deliberately obscured. Vasquez read it twice. She showed it to Park. Park read it once. He set it down on the table and looked at it for a while. "Is it real?" Vasquez asked. "The fleet composition data matches our long range sensor estimates," he said. "The communication frequencies are consistent with what we've intercepted." He paused. "It's real." Vasquez looked at the last line again. "He does not know what I know. Make it count." She thought about an old craft soldier who had spent 7 centuries winning everything, who had read all of human history, who had retreated for the first time in his life and been punished for the only honest decision he had made in the whole campaign. She thought about what it cost to send a message like that. "Well," she said, "let's not waste it." The assembly had changed. In the months since New Carthage, it had not become brave overnight. Institutions built on 4,000 years of surviving by accommodating the craft do not become brave overnight, but the fracture that New Carthage had put in the old understanding had spread quietly through every diplomatic channel and every private conversation in every member civilization. When Dr. Offer went to the assembly and said plainly that humanity needed a coalition and that this was probably the last moment in history when forming one was possible, she got something she had not gotten before, a room that was Listening, 22 civilizations sent ships. Most of them were small contributions. 3 ships here, 6 ships there. The Tenhari sent 22, a civilization called the Draw Squad and 4 armed in. Ferociously Proud sent 15 ships and a message that said simply, "We have been waiting for someone to do this first." The combined fleet that met Harrex's 340 ships numbered 186. Still outnumbered. Still showing up, Harrex's first mistake was his formation. He brought his fleet in the way he had always brought his fleet, in fast, overwhelming, confident. A broad assault spread designed to crash through resistance and keep going. He had studied the previous engagements in the human campaign and concluded that the human tactic of splitting into independent groups was a desperation measure, not a deliberate strategy. He planned to pursue each group individually and destroy them one at a time. It was a reasonable conclusion from the available evidence. It was completely wrong. Vasquez had known his command ship's position before the battle started. She had known his communication frequencies. She had known from the tactical information in the unsigned message that Herrick kept his command ships tightly grouped at the center of his formation because he believed the center was the safest place and because he had never had a reason to think otherwise. She did not wait this time. She hit the command ships in the first 8 minutes. Not with Cito's specialized weapons. Those had taken 4 months to build and the supply was limited. With everything, she put every ship she could spare onto a direct intercept course for the center of the craft formation and ordered them to ignore everything else. The craft forward ships turned to engage. They were faster. They would catch the human vessels before they reached the center. They would have, except the Tenhari. Ships were already there. The Tenhari had spent 2,000 years watching the craft fight. They had in all that time accumulated a detailed understanding of craft tactics that they had never used for anything except figuring out how to stay out of the way under different circumstances. That knowledge would have stayed unused forever. They used it now. The Tenhari fleet hit the craft forward ships from an angle that the craft had never had to account for because the Tenhari had never been an enemy before. It bought 4 minutes. 4 minutes was enough. Her command section took 11 simultaneous impacts and went dark. Battle lasted 7 hours. It was the largest engagement in galactic history since a war that had ended 800 years ago between 2 civilizations, neither of which still existed. 186 ships against 340. The numbers were still wrong. They stayed wrong the entire time. It did not matter. The craft fleet without command coordination was a different thing then. The craft fleet with it, not helpless. Individual craft captains were still dangerous, still experienced, still completely willing to fight. But they were 340 individual decisions instead of one. They could not respond to the coalition's movements as a unit. The coalition could. Vasquez had spent a year building something she could not have built any other way. Not ships, not weapons, an understanding of how to fight the craft so specific and so detailed that it had become its own kind of advantage. She knew how individual craft captains would react when their command structure failed. She knew which ones would push forward and which ones would pull back. She had written 30 pages of behavioral profiles based on recorded engagement data. Her fleet moved through the craft formation with that knowledge, the way you move through a familiar room in the dark. Harek was dead 4 hours in. His ship had taken too much damage to contain its own reactor. The explosion took 2 neighboring craft vessels with it. After that, the craft fleet did something that Vorexein's fleet had taken 700 years and one deeply honest warlord to do. It broke not an ordered withdrawal, not a strategic retreat, individual ships turning and running, each one making its own calculation, nobody coordinating. The formation dissolving into scattered flight. The coalition did not pursue far. They were too damaged for a long chase, and Vasquez was not interested in running the numbers down to the last ship. She needed the survivors to go home and report what had happened. She needed the High Council to understand. Let them go, she said. Tor looked at her. All of them, enough of them. She looked at the tactical screen, the scattered red dots that had been a craft fleet moving away in every direction. They need to deliver a message. The message arrived at the Krath High Council chamber 9 days later. It was not a formal communicate. It was the accumulated sensor logs and combat records of 131 surviving craft captains, each one reporting independently, each one describing the same thing from a different angle. The High Council read the reports in session, then they sat in silence for a while. Of the 340 ships Harek had taken to human space, 49 had made it back, 218 were destroyed. The rest were scattered, unreported, possibly destroyed, and possibly still running. The coalition had hit their second warlord prime in 2 engagements. The fleet that had seemed 8 months ago like an unstoppable force moving toward a foregone conclusion was now less than a third of what it had been. The oldest member of the High Council spoke first. He was ancient even by craft standards, which meant he had survived long enough to understand things that younger craft did not. He said, "Send for Vorexine." They found him in his quarters reading. The book was Human, a history of human conflicts on their home world, translated into craft script by an assembly language service. He had been reading it for 3 days. He put it down when the council officers came for him. He walked into the council chamber without being told what was coming. The oldest council member looked at him for a long moment. "You tried to tell us," the old craft said. "Yes," Vorexine said, "we didn't listen." No, the chamber was quiet. Outside its windows, the Krath home world turned in its stars' light. Beautiful world, old, scarred by the wars that had made the craft what they were, but still standing, still full of people going about their lives. Vorexine looked at it through the window. "What do you recommend?" the old council member asked. It was the first time in 4,000 years that the High Council had asked a field commander that question about a campaign against a species that was still alive and fighting. Vorexine thought about Elena Vasquez. He thought about the human soldier who had held a corridor alone for 4 hours. He thought about the monument builders and the grief carriers and the people who wrote their losses down and named children after their dead. He thought about the one line at the end of an unsigned message, "Make it count, talk to them." He said the negotiations were conducted by Dr. Priya Akefer on the human side and a craft diplomat on the other, with the Tenhari serving as neutral observers, which was an irony that Dr. Akefer appreciated more than she showed. They lasted 3 months. Final agreement was not a craft. Surrender, the craft did not have a cultural framework for surrender, and Vasquez and Aquifer had both agreed that trying to force one would create a resentment that would outlast the agreement itself. Instead, it was a cessation of hostilities, a return of occupied territories, and a framework for future contact. It was not a perfect agreement. No agreement that ends a war between species who nearly destroyed each other can be perfect. It had gaps and weaknesses and things both sides had argued about until everyone in the room was exhausted. It was, however, real. Dr. Aquifer signed it in the assembly chamber on a Tuesday, which seemed appropriate. Vorkstein watched the signing from Kraft space on a broadcast screen. He was no longer in his quarters. He had been returned to a role that was something between advisor and historical curiosity. The High Council listened to him now in a way they had not listened to him during the campaign. That was the Kraft way to hear the lesson only after the cost of ignoring it had already been paid. He watched the human ambassador sign the agreement and thought about what he had felt in the months of this campaign that had no name in the Kraft language. He had found a name for it eventually in a human history text, human word for a feeling that the Kraft had spent 4,000 years distributing across 14 civilizations like a tax collected from the universe. Humility, not weakness, not defeat in the sense he had always understood defeat, something else, the particular kind of clarity that came from facing something you could not simply overpower and having to become different because of it. The humans had not made him feel Voraka*. They had made him feel something stranger and more durable. He turned off the broadcast. He picked up his book. Outside his window, the Krath home world turned in the light of its star, old and scarred, and still standing. He thought about a blue and white world on the other side of the galaxy, small, soft, full of people who had been building weapons to use on each other since before they knew the stars were there to reach, and who had looked up at the Kraft fleet with all its 4,000-year certainty and decided collectively that losing was not the same as being done. He thought about that for a long time. Then he started reading again. Somewhere in human space, in a repair bay that still smelled of welding smoke and recycled air, Commander Elena Vasquez sat in a chair with a cup of cold coffee and read through the casualty list she had been putting off. For 3 months, she read every name. It took a long time. When she was done, she sat in the quiet for a while. The repair bay hummed around her. Somewhere down the corridor, Torres was laughing at something, his voice carrying through the thin walls the way voices do on ships. She folded the list. She put it in her jacket pocket close to her chest. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars. They always were. She was still here. That was enough. For now it was enough.